Hi, today we'll be looking at drawing with a rook pawn or a bishop pawn. In the last video we saw that this position with after king g5, king to b4, that was a draw because the queens come on at the same time. But instead we can create a rook pawn by playing king to h3. Pawn to h3, and the threat is h2, h1, queening. We have to take this pawn, and one way to avoid that is by playing king g4 instead of king g5, but because of the pawn on h5 making king g4 illegal, we are forced to play king g5. So after h3, then there comes pawn takes h3, and now king to b4. So that improved our king position. That improved black's king position. After king takes h5, king takes a4, king to g5, king to b4, h4. It looks like the pawns are going to queen at the same time, but there's a trick. a4, h5, a3, h6, h7, a2, h7, and then queens. And as you can see, we have complete control of the queening square. White cannot even get close to it. So even if instead of king g5 we played king g6, it's the same thing. King b4, h4, a4, h5, a3, h6, a2, h7, queens. And then after king c7, threatening king to g8, we have queen to h8, blockading the pawn. White could play smarter, and instead of in this position instead of playing h4, you can play king to f7, threatening king to g8. But after a4, h4, a3, h5, a2, h6, queens, king to g8, we simply have queen to g1 check, and he can't play king to f8 because he loses a pawn after queen g6. So he is forced to play king to h8. And now we don't play queen to g6, but instead we simply play queen to f2. And because of h7, queen to f8 checkmate, he has to move back. So king to g8, threatening h7. But then queen g3, king to h8, and we can approach by playing queen to f4, king to g7, queen to g5 check. He's forced to play king to h7 now, but now we can push our king, making a passing move, and then king to h8, queen takes h6, winning. So that's totally winning for black because of the fact that after you queen, you have complete control of the queening square of the rook. And that's the thing about rook pawns, is the first one to queen always wins when you have a rook pawn, because the queening pawn will always control the other queening pawn's square. In this position we have another example where black is threatening to take one of white's pawns. So in order to stop that, we can play king to d3, but then he plays king d5, and that creates a barrier saying, no, white king, you're not going to come through. So for example, king d3, king d5, and no matter where the king goes, he'll just match him up. King e3, king e5, king d3, king d5. Black has at least a draw in this variation, and we don't want a draw because we can win this position. So then after king to c3, king to d5, king d3, there is no way for black to win his barrier and keep it, because after this move, it's his move. He has to move to king e5, where we can play king c4, or if he moves to king to c5, we can play king e4. Now after king c3, he could play to capture our pawn. That's 3 moves. So we have 3 moves. So it'll be his move when we get to b6. But as it shows, after king d3, after king c3, king d5, king d3, if he plays king e5 now, right now he has 4 squares, and then will be 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the same thing as we've already just seen. After king c3, king e, after king c3, king e5, it's the same thing. So the other variation is he can play king c5, and then he will be will be 3 squares away, but then we will be 3 squares away. It's the exact same position, just flipped around. So in this position, he'll take our pawn and we'll be on g6. And the other way, he will be on h5 and we'll be on b6. So it's the exact same thing. So we only have to analyze one variation here. And we'll just go with king to e5. King to c4, king to f5, king to c5, king to g5, king to b6, king takes h5, king takes b6, king to g5, king to b6, h5, a6, h4, a3, h7, h3, queens, and h2. There's just no way. And we're gonna block it and win the pawn now. So that's the thing that happens with these rook pawns, that they can be so tricky. As long as you know what you're doing though, because you know that when you queen, you control the other rook pawn square, you'll be fine. And here we have a problem because we have a pawn that wants to promote, but he also has a pawn that wants to promote. And are we in the square? Well, it's our move. After king f7, a5, we have to be able to play within the square, but we can't even reach it because we'll be on e6, so we're completely gone. If we had one more tempo, then we would be in the square. He's in our square. But the cool thing about this is that if you had watched my video on pawn races, then you'll find out that we can get in the square by creating a double threat, by threatening to promote our pawn and threatening to capture this pawn. So king f7, a5, and now not king e6 because of a4, and then we can just capture the pawn on f3. So for example, king e6, a4, and if f4, a3, f5, a2, f6, queens, then we just play queen a3, and that controls the queening square and also prevents any king e7 ideas. So don't move king e6, just simply play f4. And now if king g4, king e6, we can move our king here because he spent a tempo moving his king, so we can spend a tempo moving our king. And now we are going to be within the square. So if he captures that pawn, we're in the square. And if he pushes a pawn, our pawn's queen at the same time. So it works out. So his only move here is to continue pushing the pawn. And now we have a4, f5, a3, f6, a2, and now we have a decision to make because he's about to queen. And that's what he's going to do in the next move, which will play f7. But the problem is that we have actually a few squares we can move to. Move to any of these squares. Which ones are we going to move to? Well, let's say we try to move away from the queening square for some reason. King to e6. We've already seen that this loses because of queen to a3. And it's similar if king to g6, because if queens, f7, and now we play queen to h8, but not queen to a3 because of king g7. We have to control this queening square and the possibility of the white king getting inside the 7th rank. So now we know that these squares are gone. Let's check out king e8. Well, that still doesn't work because of you queen, and after f7 you have king to e8, and then after king to d8, then you have queen to f6 check. He has to protect the pawn. King to e8, queen to e6, and he's going to lose a pawn now if he goes king d8. And that's the thing about bishop pawns when you have the king in the middle, is that there's no stalemate. When he plays king to f8, then we play king to g6, king to g5, king f8, king g5, king to g8, and then king to g6, king to h8. Not queen takes f7 stalemate, but king takes f7. And then that's a checkmate. King to h7, queen g6, king to h8, queen to g8. So we've already seen a couple of squares that don't work, and we know that king e8 doesn't work, king g6 doesn't work, and king e6 doesn't work. So now we can play between any of these four squares. Let's see. We have king e7, king f8, king g7, and king to g8. Let's look at the dark squares first. If we have king to g7, then our pawn's pinned, so that doesn't work at all. So we can play king to e7, but then after your queen, then king to pawn to f7, queen to e5 check, and we have the same situation as before. Then king to f8, king to g6, king to g8, and here's a cool checkmating pattern to remember. King to g6, because after your queen on f8, then you have a checkmate in 3. Can you find it? Here's a checkmate in 3, starting with queen e6 check, and then after king to h8, queen to h3 check, king to g8, queen to h7 checkmate. So that's a cool checkmating pattern to remember. And what's interesting is that if it wasn't check after queen e6, this queen can't even check the king right now. The queen is in a really bad spot. So we'll see more examples of that as we go on. So we've seen that these squares, king e7, king e8, king e6, king g6, and king g7 do not work. King f8 is the last try, but after your queen on a1, f7, queen to h8 check, king to e7, queen to e5 check, and it's the same position as before. The only move here is for white to play king g8. So then after queens, you have queen pawn to f7, and then you have to bring the queen closer. If the king tries some checkmating pattern like we just saw, the queen would have to be here, because now we have queen e6, queen e8 check, and that's a draw. So he has to pin the pawn, but then we just play king to h8, and if queen to a8, then king to g7, and that's a draw, as we've seen many times. So now the next example is this one, where we have a bishop pawn, and we're threatening to promote here, but the problem is he's in the square of the pawn, and so after c4 he has king to b4, and then if king to c7, then king to b7. So c4, king to b4, king to b7, we can push our pawn, and then that's obviously a draw, or actually winning for black, sorry. So after king to c6, a4, c5, a3, king to b6, a2, c6, queen, c7, and then you have queen to a5 check, and you'll be able to win the pawn. King to b7, and then you can just keep torturing the king by playing queen to b6, and if king to a8, then queen to c6 check, king to b8, and then you have to pin the pawn or actually you could play, yeah, you can pin the pawn here. And then if king to b7, then king to b5, and if he queens, well, actually, wait, this might be a draw. Let me just double check. So after king to a8, we can actually just take this pawn. So then we'll sacrifice our queen for this pawn, and then this pawn will just march forward, and it'll be a win for black. So that's the trump card that we have. So after king to c7, which is the only move, if he tries king to b5, then here's the thing. We're going to go catch this pawn and then try to get a stalemate with the bishop pawn. But we have a pawn here that we have to get rid of, or else there's no stalemate. We'll just play c4 when we have no moves, and then he'll checkmate us. So he'll take the pawn and then bring the king closer and checkmate us. So we have to give up the pawn. King b5, c4. And actually we don't play c4 just yet. But after king b5, king to d5. Now we can threaten to promote. So after a5, c4 now. And king to takes c4, king to e6, a4, king takes f6, a3, and if we have to choose the right square again, but we can actually play king e7 now, a2, f6, queens, f7, and this would be losing for white after queen e5, king f8, because black here would play king to g6. In the last variation, the king was on h5. But here we can just play king to e8 safely. And after king to d5, king to g8. And then we will be able to safely get a stalemate. So he can only check us queen g5, and then king to h8, and then queen to h6, king to g8, queen to g6, king to h8, draw. In the last example, we have this position where it looks like that black can take our pawns, and then he can just push his pawn forward to promote. If we try doing something like king to f7, king to f2, king to g7, king takes g2, f4, h3, f5, h2, f6, queens, f7. He doesn't have any check here, so it looks like we'll be able to straightforward queen. But after queen f1, we can queen. Queen takes queen on f8, king takes queen on f8, but then he has h5, and he's going to promote that pawn. What we have to do now is actually king to f6, and what that does is it threatens to capture this pawn, because after king f2, king to g5, and then king takes g2, king takes h4, king takes f3. This is a classic draw. We're going to block it and capture the pawn. So he's going to prevent that from happening by playing king f4. He met our threat, and he's going to continue by playing king g3 and then king takes pawn. But we're not going to let him, because after king to g7, king to g3, now we can take the pawn. And then king takes h7, king takes g2, f4, h3, f5, h2, f6, and he queens with check. But now we can just play king to g8, but not king to g7 because he pins our pawn. So we play king to g8, and he doesn't have any check anymore. He could play queen to a8, and that would cause a disaster. His only move is queen to h6, but then we play f7, and this is a draw. This is the only example where the bishop pawn can draw on the 6th rank, is when the king gets in the way of the queen, or if this was a pawn, something gets in the way of the queen. So I hope you enjoyed this video on drawing with a rook or bishop pawn examples, and if you liked it, feel free to give it a thumbs up. The donate link is in the description if you would like to donate. I would really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.